of the analytical framework when we come into a political economic framework. And Sheila's own work on the regional aspect of financial systems is a demonstration of the twin interaction of power and uncertainty and how that drives and leads toward inequality. So that derives from hierarchy, as we talked about last night, and spatial hierarchies are a way of depicting power relations. The examples we're going to look at today are going to be examples where we're going to drill down into spatial hierarchies. So what we're going to do tonight is to take this spatial geographic view of some economic policy ideas that have been suggested for solving local, national, and global problems. And again, I'm going to apologize right now in advance to you, and especially to Penny for being, I was already going to be late, but now it's late and improvised. Our first two cases are working with very stylized models. Cases 3 and 4 are going to reintroduce the macro logic that we introduced in lecture 1, and then take it further and talk about a proposal for dealing with financing sustainable development goals and global warming that I think will in turn, that's been something I presented at the UN, that will be then a springboard for Penny's further remarks tonight. Okay, so first, there's this presentation on taking a global macro-micro approach to urban dynamics. So reimagining urban and regional economics and economic development policy. Now we start actually with this quote from Robert Park, who was one of the sociologists. He was a Darwinian. He was a kind of a person who worked with racial hierarchies and so on. And so this, he was one of the founders of an approach to understanding the city that was sociological. Now, indeed, the city as a natural Darwinian process is the first way that we would imagine a city. And I just want to say that urban and regional economic social theory is a contested terrain because it's an intersection point between economics, geography, sociology, anthropology, etc. And that in the Park-Burgess model focused on Chicago and took the view that basically there was kind of a natural order of human beings, that there were some people who were worthy and of a higher status and class and biologically more fit, and there were others who were less fit. And this ordering from the slum and the Black Belt to the immigrant district to the nice suburban district. This is a 1925 book called The City, of a landmark in urban in urban sociology. And this turns into, actually, you can see it's exactly a map of Chicago, Illinois, first of all. But leaving that aside, it has to be that there's people are fit in, that essentially the fact that you have low-income people suffering and living in tenements that are together and full of disease is a natural order. It's not a problem. Power is there, and power is wielded by the fit, those who deserve to have it. Now, a very different model came forth from Chris Aller, who was looking at cities in southern Germany, and he was looking at the multi-centric model of Germany and seeing how it was organized. Well, this model here turns into the abstract model that we see in urban theory, where urban theory turns what was human settlement and the passion and contrast and interactions between people full of racism and violence and so on. I mean, to the very day, Chicago is a tough city, and it turns it into this imagined, idealized space. This is the space with which urban economists work. When I mentioned that Krugman was trying to bring about order into, the advanced mathematical methods into urban geography, into geography, he precisely was working with the mathematics that arise when you basically turn geography into abstract space where distance is the only thing that really matters. And of course, another way of looking at the city was one that we've encountered again on day one, Schelling's model of racial segregation. Now, Schelling I'm, as I showed you, I kind of made him serve my purpose of talking about the problem of racial segregation and discrimination in the credit market. But his pure model is actually a model of individual choice. So there he is, a very, a Nobel Prize winner and a very eclectic and distinguished man, I guess, Harvard. But basically, he set up this idea of neighborhood segregation. And as we talked about, the idea was that, segregation occurs through, and it's, as we showed, I guess on Monday or Tuesday, it occurs because of choice. The whites don't want to live around the blacks. They just get away from them. It's just individual choice. Now, the final model we might note is the model of the so-called new economic geography model that comes from Krugman's sort of thinking deeper about what happens when transportation costs become less and firms locate close together, or for that matter, people celebrating culture and so on. And basically, this is, these different visions show how economists can use their tools to talk about spillovers, neighborhood effects, and so on. And while urban economics goes in this direction of and the kind of geographic approach to the cities and so on, goes in this abstract direction, macro theory, as we noted, has been captured by general equilibrium modeling. And so we only see, thinking about the broader level, the higher level of transactions in a very restricted way. And so just to say here that there's the conclusion is that human society is rapidly becoming urban. Macro policy is off the table. And the global is going through a micro logic, and the new economic geography tells us that the creative cities framework and so on is the way forward. So we now come to the case example, Europe 2020, the economic development framework for the European Union builds exactly on the new economic geography in the ideas of agglomeration, things being close together, reduce the space, and devolve policies to the local areas. Well, there's then this logic of innovative, sustainable, inclusive cities as what should happen. Now, my second bullet point says that, well, what happens though is that you have austerity, fiscal policies, macro policies, wage suppression, other things, but this is just set aside, considered unimportant. And basically, you then have a situation in which, essentially, there are limits to that model. That those are limits, by the way, if you think about the European Union and the European Monetary Union in particular, these are places that lack central banks with the ability to issue credit, to issue money in their own currency. They're part of a monetary union, and therefore fiscal policy, the old rules are restricted. You have to suppress your spending. There's no macro policy. All you got is micro policy, and so that's what you do. And this is something that was also, then critiqued by in the U.S. or excuse me, in Europe and in the U.K. These are some of the people, Ron Martin, Pike, Tyler, and Gardner, who were among the critiquers, saying, there's something wrong with that. The reason is that these approaches are supply side approaches. They assume that macro policy doesn't matter, that the austerity that was imposed, for example, in the 2010s after the subprime crisis had no impact. It wasn't important. Austerity macro policy is irrelevant. If you want to grow, then you look at your own productive apparatus, look at your own city, look at your own people, your managers, and if you're not prospering, if you have a productivity problem, which is something I was working on earlier today with a different team, your productivity problem is something about you and your firms, because basically that's where we look, is the supply side. Finance is in none of these models because basically it's assumed that finance works under the efficient market theory. Finance is passive. It will respond if there are opportunities. And so basically we ignore all of the imbalances. And what I suggest here by way of critique is to say, wait a minute, finance can malfunction. It can become a rent-seeking fragile power block, hindering your growth. The reason is that basically, as we noted, we now have a global financial system in which there's a lot of offshore capital moving around within the system of securitization and so on, and they can deny you credit for your small businesses and so on. That becomes one of the problems, in fact, that we were talking about today as a problem in the UK, much less in the developing economies of the world. And so, once you see this, then you see, no, we have to have that macro layer. We have to think about cross-border imbalances and problems. And, then we can get to more realistic assessments of what's going on. And here I'll just say that I've got this macro micro approach that says that, what you want to do if you're going to be realistic and thinking about what's really possible is you want to basically say, well, let's get serious about our region, our policies. What's the nature of your macro system? What kind of macroeconomy do you have? That's, if you see this along the left-hand side, what kind of what assumptions are you making about what kind of economy you're in? Do you have a supply-based economy, supply-driven, so that Say's law holds, and so on? Do you have a economy where there's some sticky prices, but otherwise things work, as in contemporary New Keynesian economics? Or do you think, as Keynesians do, that aggregate demand matters independently of anything else, including supply? Now, along the top, you then would want to say, well, let's think about our industrial structure. What kind of structure do we have? Now, the choices I present there along the top are, well, you could just take the kind of normal linear, like Schraffian style system of production. You can imagine that there's some local spillovers that could be captured, or you could go with a full increasing returns to scale agglomeration driven approach to how you need to take care of and think about your policy. So are you here? There's where, if you're a mainstream economist, you're going to imagine that you are there probably. Um, are you instead, just ignoring the micro level? If you're taking sort of a macro Keynesian perspective, macro matters, but microstructure doesn't matter, then see, I would say, please, I appreciate that you're Keynesian, but take into account the structures at the lower spatial scales. They matter. I'm not going to let you get away with just doing a one level macro model and saying just pour something into this or some demand and it's all okay. I'm also not going to be happy with you if you go with just new Keynesian economics, because I would say let's go and think about the fact that actually increasing returns, agglomeration, all that matters, but at the same time, where we really are, it's not the only thing that matters. That was what was in European industrial policy. It was all about that, no macro layer, but instead, let's go to the fact that we need an independent macro policy for, like in that case, European prosperity. Now, actually, at this point, let me just say that there's parallels here in terms of how financial structures work. I think in the interest of time, I will just, point to a couple of things here, just to say that we can locate Stiglitz here, and then we can locate Minsky under golden age growth, and then Minsky in the neoliberal era, where mega banking matters. But let's move on, and I'll actually then skip through some of the next couple of slides too, in the interest of time, and with apologies, just to say that this was part of a lecture that went on to talk about how you can really take care of some problems of deindustrialization. But again, I don't want to keep you all night, and I have a couple of other models to run through as we go through things. And so just to say that the one thing we brought up structuralism the other night, and just to say that Celso Furtado's vision, as you would imagine, is a holistic vision that takes into account all kinds of factors that are important, as he and the colleagues that were part of founding CEPAL had these ideas of capturing industrial strength and paying close attention to and correcting imbalances of trade across borders. Okay. I'll now then go through and just skip a couple of things there. And let's now go to case example number 2. The problems of spontaneous, we're going to take on this kind of micro story now, the idea of spontaneous urban growth in developing economies. This is an idea. Now here, I apologize. We're going to talk about a lot more than financial exclusion here. We're going to talk about actually the structure of cities and how they work. And so in this extent here, what we're going to do is we're going to go and we're going to actually take a look at, hold on a second, at another kind of aspatial approach. And this is an aspatial approach in which that we've seen an intervention by Hernando de Soto, he of the mystery of capital and so on. And basically, we're going to argue that de Soto is taking an aspatial approach. Now, de Soto is thinking about, Lima, Peru, or, wherever he's thinking, but we could be thinking about Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo or Mexico City. And when we think about developing economies, we're thinking about, cities in which space matters and in which these, micro barriers in neighborhoods differ one to another in ways that are really significant. Here's one way of looking at the city, or actually in Brazil, you'd say the informal city and then the more informal city. And actually to say that this has consequences, and again, we're not going to focus on the financial here, but just to say that those who have street addresses can have bank accounts in Brazil. That's now changing. So what we have are those who have bank accounts, those who don't. Agiotas are the informal street corner lenders in Brazil. And so we have the banked, the semi-banked, and the mostly unbanked. So we have these encounters of areas and pictures. These are initially pictures of football fields in Brazil. And it's just, there we are in the what people value, what they make space for is football. And actually, this is a famous field. It says, the words don't come out well, but aqui nasceu o fenômeno. So this is actually where Ronaldo, o Fenômeno, first played his football when he was a young man. And there's a better picture of that same field. It's in the midst of an area that's sort of between the formal and informal, the favela, the other parts of the city. And we see this as part of Brazil. And we see the predominance of favelas all through the city. This is something that people live with there, that the city's growth, the formal city is like right there, and there's Copacabana, and there's Ipanema, but most of the city is informal. And here's another picture, and basically here's this is one of the favelas there. This is Rocinha, and basically these are areas that are sort of beyond the tourist space and where most of the people live. And one of the problems that we were looking at with the planning director of the BNDES was about what, let's figure out what's going on with this model. What are the implications of this growth, this tremendous extensive growth of the informal areas of the city as the city region, as it expanded. And so, and one implication was there were transportation problems. These lines, these are the metro lines, they don't go, this is an old map, but they don't go all the way out here. And there are people where it would take them 2 or 3 hours to get to work from where they lived when they were, let's say, working in domestic service or in a restaurant or something in the centro. So now that's the situation, complicated situation. And what we have then is Hernando de Soto writing in and basically saying, well, this, all we have to do is to give people property rights. And that's the problem. People are living in these places informally, and they don't have the rights of property where they live. If we just gave them the property rights, they would have collateral, they could create capital. And look at this expression here. They have houses but not titles, crops but not deeds, businesses but not statutes of incorporation. It is the unavailable of these essential representations that explains why people who have adapted every other Western invention have not been able to produce sufficient capital to make their domestic capitalism work. This is the mystery of capital. And I have to say, I became completely furious as I read that analysis. If you know anything about the favelas in Rio de Janeiro, you would know that everybody pays rent. Now, whether or not the person to whom you pay rent has a deed and title down at City Hall, that's another question. But basically, this idea that he has is ridiculous. And it can only come from somebody who has no clue of what's going on in the actual cities and metropoli of the developing world. So, it's factually wrong. As I note here, favelas are not full of land that's not owned. It might be owned by a gang, right? It might be owned by the Vermelho, but that's another question. Secondly, his analysis is rooted in supply side economics. You can see it there in the way he thinks about things, and it's completely aspatial. There's no spatial dimension. Why does he ignores urban infrastructure? So let's go back to good old Tom Schelling, and there's his thing where all the pieces on the board are free to move. And so the little white, now we have W and B, white and black. So all the white little pieces, they don't want to be around the black little pieces. So they just move away and they create segregation. Well, let's go with this, only let's change it. Let's imagine that we have a formal sector, F. Some spaces are formal sector, and then some spaces are informal sector. And let's imagine that what's happening, as you saw in Rio, is that the informal sector is growing. Now, I set up a little simple simulation model. It's a complexity model of the simplest kind, literally a toy. And basically just said, and let's just play with it a little bit. Let's imagine that there's a firm here making tradable goods. There's a couple of firms doing non-tradables. There's some government workers. There's where some of the workers live. And let's just suppose that everybody living in outside the city is a domestic worker. So these people travel into the city to work in the houses of these people. And, pretty realistic, if you think of like Hosina as a working suburb of the formal city. And basically what happens if it grows? Now, I played with this simulation, and what we're going to do here is we're going to have the formal city is going to be gray. And so we're graying it out. So basically, if we can expand the formal sector, now this is a sector, the formal sector, where taxes are paid, people are paid good wages, there's, kind of stable middle class jobs created, et cetera, and, and so on, that you see the growth and you can expand the core, you can expand the formal sector, you can build your infrastructure. But what happens by contrast if what you have is the periphery is growing and growing, and actually what's happening is that more and more of the tradables are going into the informal mode of production? Well, what's going to happen is that basically, if nobody owns the land, everything stays, constant. But if you start to have people getting charged rent for occupying their land, you're going to start to see a squeeze. And what will ultimately happen, and this is the punchline of this model, is that over here, you're going to see the shrinkage of the formal sector, because the middle class here is not going to be able to pay the taxes to sustain the well-being of the city. Basically, if the rich escape paying, and indeed take their money to foreign lands, as they do, bank accounts in Florida, that kind of thing, then basically it's going to be your middle class workers, your wage earners, and your government workers who are going to be the people who are going to be paying for the infrastructure in the city. And so, using this arbitrary agent-based model, we just show some of these pressures, and basically that, the cost of maintaining and even not to mention expanding the formal infrastructure is too much. You start to get to where you can't pay for it. And that puts pressure on your unionized workers and public sector workers. And the firms are driven into bankruptcy. You have tax revolt and so on, or into the informal sector. So this model shows this blind spot in DeSoto's model of democratic entrepreneurship. And it comes from just adding in this simple fact of pervasive rent payments. And we also can think about migration without growth, people coming from the rural areas looking for ways to survive and send money to their families. And basically, DeSoto also misses because he disregards the importance of the state sector in maintaining legitimacy and governance. The middle class is placed under structural pressure by the growing weight of this informal sector, and basically, it's an impossible situation. Income inequality grows. The wealthy can threaten to leave, to take their money elsewhere, and you get into a self-reinforcing cycle. The government can't formalize the informal sectors to make the city less livable, to make the city, chicer or, more livable. And so the rich withdraw more deeply away from the city. The rich will sit around and talk about, the good old days when the formal city was so nice, but now look, there's a favela around the corner, and we have to pay more taxes, and we want to get out of here. When's my flight to Miami? This type of thing. And this ability, this, again, asymmetric ability to escape is part of the power that people have. You have the power when you have resources to invest, and you have the power to leave. And that becomes one of the challenges for this situation. So as the city informalizes more and more, wages stagnate and fall. The formal sector residents look ever more like a spoiled elite. At the same time, they're overtaxed. They're overwhelmed by these changes in their city. They want to express their anger, their sense of betrayal. The politics of resentment only needs a leader. Who's that going to be? How about Bolsonaro? Is that the rise? But let's leave aside the whether or not Bolsonaro is capable of organizing that. But you can see that if he were, we would see that. That's the direction he wants. He wants to delegitimize elections. That's the direction he's going. Where does that end? This is a country that already had a dictatura, and do they need another one? I don't think so. But basically, you can see how only if we really comprehensively understand the spatial scaling interacting with political economic dynamic are we really going to be able to get the whole picture of what's going on in a metropolis as complicated as Rio de Janeiro, or for that matter, places like Mexico City. And notice that, as we mentioned the other day, that it's the irreversibility, the spatial fixity that creates challenges for agents who don't control outcomes. And again, just a kind of passing critique of Harvey. Here's a case where finance and spatial fix is not just the only way that finance enters in. Finance becomes a way to allow people to escape the city, and this becomes a challenge for people. I've just got a few pictures here. I spent a good bit of time working with folks in a favela called Mare, Hedges de Mare, and this is you can see their loyalties there shown on the flagpole. Here's a market, and just some pictures of the Complexo de Mare, 130,000 people. This was an area, I could tell you a lot of stories about this place, but they set up the Hedges, as was the community center. There's the director, a wonderful person. And at this center, every time a student passed the vestibular to go into one of the public universities, their name went up on the honor board. This was something that where this community, which was seen as violent and beyond the pale, self-organized in order to take care of itself. Okay, great, but not the solution. Okay, now we're on the third of our four parts. This is a shorter part because what we're going to do here is just remember some of the things we've talked about and kind of go a second time, but with a different emphasis through the idea of the kind of the global macroeconomic dynamics and constraints as they exist. This is going to set us up to talk about the financing proposal that's on the table for taking care of climate change and the sustainable development goals. And so we'll get to that. Just to redo a couple of things. Keep in mind that there's basically there's our trade balance, current account, the trade account, the is offset by capital outflows or changes in reserves. And basically just reminding you that money flows across borders whenever there's an imbalance. Either the money flows in, if you have a trade account, a trade balance, or a surplus rather, or the money flows out if you have a trade deficit. And so if you do have a trade deficit, as say the UK does, then basically you're going to depend on either an inflow of capital. So keep in mind that these figures can all be negatives or positive numbers. A negative capital outflow is an inflow. So if you have a negative on the left-hand side, a negative trade balance, you're gonna need capital inflows, which are going to show up there as a negative to counterbalance that. Either that or spend down your reserves. And so this is something that we can then, as noted, we can then combine this with the macroeconomic balance equation. Planned and unplanned aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. Merging this together, this gives us that other equation we had. And just to take a look at this, that on the left-hand side, for every spatial area, could be we normally think of nation states, but this could be a region, this could be a neighborhood, this could be the block, this could be your house. Basically, what is to be financed? Government deficit and the investment you want to do, investment, purchasing longer term assets. How are you going to do that? Well, either you're going to have the savings in hand to pay for that, or else you're going to have to get savings from elsewhere. Either that or spend down your reserves. So on the left, what must be financed, on the right, how it can be financed. And this is a border condition. Now, what I've done here is to merge those equations together to where what we see here is basically, we can keep in mind that essentially every spatial area has to solve these problems. Okay, now let's just zone back out into the global system for a minute, just to say that, well, we had this deregulation, the neoliberal era started, the crisis in the 1980s, as we talked about, led to the Federal Reserve certifying that its banks were too big to fail, and then eventually deregulating them and giving them total power to move across borders inside the country and across global borders. And also the Fed Reserve willing to play the role of not only a national lender of last resort to provide liquidity where needed to protect the integrity of the financial system and of the currency, but then to be a global, an international lender of last resort. Now, this has consequences. This was one example here is some pictures from Korea. I am fired is the way of they think about the IMF in 1997, 98. And a consequence for the US was that because of the buildup of its financial power, because it set up this deregulated power and became a safe haven in this era of financial crises, the dollar, as we noted, I think on Tuesday night, retained this, exorbitant privilege. And basically people want to hold the dollar and they want to escape. They want to go to Miami with their savings from Rio de Janeiro. And so consequently, what we see is that the US has maintained a net deficit on trade through the entire, pretty much, with 1 year exception, neoliberal period. Again, I have to apologize. I had updated figures which were part of the slides that I lost when I did the stupid thing and erased my my up-to-date presentation. So sorry for that. But the pattern is very clear. Net capital inflows are the mirror face of the trade deficit. The two things go hand in hand. And so this defines the structure of the neoliberal era global economy. The US with its trade deficit, having capital account inflows, and then basically, losing dollar reserves to foreign holders. The rest of the world is in net trade surplus with capital account outflows building up their reserves outside the US. This defines a global architecture that shapes the relationships among the global areas in the world. And so this has, lots of impacts, but basically it's this double power of the US in terms of the balances on the developing economies. Basically, US companies are shifting then toward outsourced and global factory production. That was part of why you see that trade deficit grow. You're looking for the race to the bottom wages. They locate factories in Mexico. They do fabrication sites in East Asia, South Asia, China, etc., and basically take that away from their workers, leading to the contradictions that Wolfgang Streeck talks about as buying time in the so-called advanced economies, but then leading to this steady inflow of money into the US. That money's looking for assets to buy, and senior fellows recognizing that the US was the global consumer of last resort, that basically every nation was being disciplined by their current account balance have to be maintained, except for the US. This was called the N-1 theory, Jörg Niehaus. The idea was that if N-1 countries must discipline themselves, the nth country will take up the residual. That's exactly what happened, of course. And they were sitting around this lunch table or discussion table, and they were happy with that. We point out, well, this is a contradiction. No, not for the US. In 1985-86, it wasn't a problem. It was just part of the way global capitalism worked. Consequence, of course, is that US dollars are, now this again, old figures, I apologize, have flowed into reserve holdings, even the euro is just taking a second place to that, the Japanese yen and the pound being afterthoughts now. So this then leads to the business of debt. Now, let me just say that what we're going to do here is I want to point out, I'm going to skip this slide and talk about the fact that the mega banks that grew up, they created these shadow banking networks, shadow banks where they can create securities for the securities, take their loans, make them securities, take them offline, sell them to funds and others who can hold them. They can be in any country. And those funds, hedge funds and so on, are largely unregulated. Therefore, you take a regulated entity that has to watch its capital accounts and so on, and you throw a lot of the credit that it originates out to others. And so you are no longer accountable for the credit worthiness of the credit that you originate. So, what happens is that you start to see lots of games being played, lots of derivatives, lots of ways of hedging against risk, which create opportunities for others to take zero-sum bets. And so we see this incredible growth of debt, and of the debt-affiliated global financial sector that goes along with it, creating Minsky instability on a global scale. And just to say that this, of course, is what blew up in the 2008 and subsequent financial crisis, the so-called Great Financial Crisis. This is actually something done by a president of one of the Federal Reserve banks. This should show that they too got really worried about all this. It was they, not radicals, who were pointing out the adverse consequences, the negative vortex of this kind of global financial system. And there you see the boom and then the bust in subprime originations, classic. And post-crisis, you'd think, well, what happened post-crisis? This is after the the subprime crisis was over. What happened? Well, first of all, bank lending to the real economy goes down supremely much. It really takes a dive. The banks really stopped lending for a long time. And what they're doing is healing their balance sheets. They are still healing their balance sheets. That's part of the so-called quantitative easing. And meanwhile, however, they stay big. These are the pictures of the largest banks as a of the assets of the largest banks in the world, and these assets are tremendous. And actually, they also exceed the level of in many cases, of GDP. There's your quantitative easing that also builds up with the crisis and never really dies. Because what's happening here is that the central banks, first of all, have bought a lot of paper from the banks and implicitly from their funds, these shadow bank funds, in order to take that what can sometimes be bad paper off their balance sheets and keep them going. And also, the Federal Reserve and the other central banks are now at the base of the global money market. The global money market negative, and it's the advanced economies go from deficit, into surplus, and the developing economies who were growing faster and who had surpluses on trade with with the advanced economies, they go into deficit. They are forced to borrow. They become part of the systematic debt economy. And here's just a picture. It's an old picture. Again, apologies. But what it does show is that, levels of debt relative to GDP are rising throughout. And you might say to yourself, well, didn't these big banks learn their lesson? Didn't they, we saw that the subprime volumes really went down. Subprime lending became an afterthought market. But no, they didn't. Actually, what grew up very quickly was something called leverage loans. This is a market that basically grew, and this graph just shows you, if you looked up the names of these big banks, these are mostly mega banks here, and these are the same players who took the market seizing positions that led us right into the subprime crisis, often working through subsidiaries. So these are the guilty parties, the ones who were made too big to fail, who survived in some way. And here they are. Now they're playing a game of Russian roulette with a new market, leveraged loan market. A leveraged loan, by the way, is a loan where basically there's no criteria. You don't know what's in it. There's collateral that's really pledged. And essentially it's a super risky loan equivalent to the, no name, no job, no collateral subprime loans that were made at the height of the subprime crisis, or boom, I should say. And here's the Wall Street Journal worrying about the fact that basically suddenly they turn away from it. And I have to say, leveraged loans and their uncertain fate was part of what caused the near meltdown of the repo market, the money market, last November. Again, these banks, right? Because this is a situation where you may know, and this is something that Marcus Brunemeyer has shown in some of his work on financial macroeconomics, that you may know that eventually this market's going to crash. But if it doesn't crash until the week after next, why don't you get in there and make some money? Because you've got fees to make, and you want to secure your competitive position. And indeed, that's the way these markets go. And just a final couple of slides here before we get into the last segment of the talk today, and that is just to say that in this game, money flows into the emerging markets only basically from time to time. And notice that, essentially, it's when the developed economies who are here in the light gray line, they, well, they got most of the money, and then we had the subprime crisis, and then we see money flowing into the emerging markets. So that's, the offshore centers are always there. And where does the money go? Well, it goes into lots of different places, but especially that money's been going into developing Asia in recent years. Now, final part. Blended finance for development. Now, let's go now to a presentation. Again, I'm going to give it to you straight because I didn't have my adaptation of this was lost when I lost my earlier PowerPoint. Basically, so I'm sitting in the United Nations, November 2019, part of this expert panel, and we were considering the problem of how to finance the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, set in 2015, to basically, promote inclusive growth, protect the environment, and promote social inclusion. This is basically how do we meet the sustainable development goals. This then links into how do we finance the carbon targets set in the Paris Accords. And what was pointed out was that overseas development assistance funds are too low to fill these gaps. So the idea was that, well, blended finance could come in. Now, blended finance, what it does is to say a private sector firm, a bank, let's say, is going to make a loan to fund this public purpose. But what it wants you to do is it wants you to de-risk the loan. And who's going to take that risk? Well, it's going to be a public entity. Could be a government, could be a public bank, a development bank. But that's the idea, is that they'll make the loan, the money that can be securitized, bundled into the loans can be bundled securities that can then be underwritten just in the way that actually, as they were looking back at the subprime markets as those developed, and basically this could be a great way to tap into the fact that we need globally, this was an UNCTAD estimate at the time, $2.5 trillion to meet the sustainable development goals. That's about 3% of global GDP. At the minute that I was presenting there, the world was far short of that, and blended finance had only raised something like somewhere shy of $100 billion. They were well short of that. So what do you do? Well, an earlier session of the group of experts had said that let's basically work toward understanding what blended finance could be. This is just what the words here say, so sorry for that. But we could set up a 3-tiered system. What we could do is we can imagine this architecture that was set out by a eminent persons group that was assembled by the G20. The G20 right these days is acting as a de facto world government in a certain way. And what was proposed here in this 2018 October report is called Making the Global Financial System Work for All. They said, let's have a 3-tiered system. At the top, you have the IMF, the board of the IMF that maintains control and surveillance over the whole thing. Then the international financial institutions should be joined up, and they should be shifted from making loans to making loan guarantees and underwriting. The multinational development banks could also be shifted in their roles. Then we have loans made and securitized on a local basis to encourage entrepreneurship and whatnot, and then to throw that into that upper system. Now, there was a report that was presented at this, on this situation by Judith Tyson of the Overseas Development, International Institute, and they basically said, well, how could this happen? This is what's supposed to happen. But they point out that, some people say, well, this is modern. Let's do this the way it should be done. Now, at this point, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through a couple of slides because there's some things we've been through. Because at this point, this was my presentation. I was reminding people about some of the episodes of financial crisis that were associated with securitization and so on. And the fact that we had Brady bonds that basically became monitors of creditworthiness for developing countries and were used to discipline their fiscal policies. That's the direction you would be going. And I then point out to this group that this was also the direction. The Brady bond was essentially the model for what became the subprime security. Again, it monitored the behavior of people, many of whom lost their homes. And I showed them that the subprime boom and bust happened. And basically just concluded by saying that, look, you couldn't do much with it. The claims, the property claims of the globalized securities holders trumped the with due apologies for the word, they trumped the interest of the homeowners. You couldn't cram down the mortgages, so what you had was insolvency, people losing their homes. That was because this whole system was linked into what Adam Tooze calls the cross-Atlantic, financial system, the transatlantic financial system, where it has grown and interpenetrated. And it's this system that has to be kept afloat because nobody knows how to survive without it. And so basically, just to say, beware the promises from securitization. It's not all of that. It can lead to ruin for those who, in this case, it's intending to help, assuming that anybody cares in Wall Street. And basically, let me skip ahead here to just my last couple of slides, just to say that, the problems we've seen are problems where, the emerging market economies are growing faster than the global economy as a whole. That's still true. That means that you can see the impact of austerity in the global north. That means that you're going to be growing faster. That means that your, percentage GDP growth is going to be, possibly compromised if you get into trouble. Let me skip through these slides here that basically just show those same things I showed before of current account deficits and imbalances and so on. And really just to come and to make the point here at the end with you, just to say that, we really have externally, debt-driven growth really emerging. And let me finish so I don't take too much more time with just, where do we go with all this? The point of that presentation to the UN was to throw cold water, to use the English expression, the English language expression, to throw cold water on the idea that there was this magical solution called blended finance that could motivate the private sector to get involved. I have to say, as I've been working here in the UK on regional recovery and so on, regional inequality and recovery, that blended finance is being mentioned again here. In fact, and not surprising, it's coming up here as something that would be a solution for the underdeveloped, less developed northern regions in which, Leeds is located among other cities. And so, this is not something that's a recitation from history. The fact was, though, that at that presentation in 2019, that there were people from the panel in which I participated who had just been to Wall Street trying to sell the idea of blended finance. And what the Wall Street mega bank representatives with whom they talked said, well, first of all, those people left after 90 minutes of the meeting. And they said, no, we're not interested. We need volume, we need it to be fast, and we need it to be standardized. We're not interested in playing games with you. We're not interested in this. Show us how we can make money. And we need to make money at scale and at pace. And if we can't do that, we're not interested in you. So basically, this leads me to my conclusions. A couple of pages here. One is that the mega bank system has got to change. The global system was saved in 2008-9 only because a central bank used a currency with exorbitant privilege whose value is now being squandered by, well, in that case, the Trump administration. But now it's not that things are going much better. You're not going to be able to do this again, was my point. The magical Fed of Ben Bernanke, that was a one-time event. If you read Tooze's work, you'll see that he's worried about that too. Secondly, this system, this global system, mega bank centered system, has polarized wealth and income to an extent that it's destroying the very fabric of nation states. National governments cannot provide for their people, and people are on the move. As we pointed out the other night, remittances are now larger than overseas development assistance. Political reactions are killing democratic consent, fomenting extremist, anarchist, and even fascist movements. And this, furthermore, in the context of green, the global climate change, stranding of assets cannot be predicted. Climate change is going to accelerate the volume of stranded assets. What about all those expensive hotels on the beach in Copacabana? Are they one day going to be stranded assets? Probably. So what do we do about that? So you can't, pin the cost of saving such places on the weak and the vulnerable. So this is a systems problem, not a point problem. Since the 80s, there's been a fierce global competition to be at the top of the tree in this winner-take-all game of global banking and finance. The game has been won for now by the US based mega banks, plugged into the Federal Reserve's backstopping of the hyper-leveraged global money markets. European banks have competed and lost. The ECB will not and can never be the Fed, but the Fed itself is being undermined by current events. There is no alternative to the US dollar-backed financial system now, but we need an alternative. So why not, this was me then talking there, why not remake European banking in collaboration with developing economy banking, the financing vehicle that will underwrite the transition to global environment and social sustainability. Now, if you've been following the financial times, you will know that the European banking union is in trouble, but that was just said then. So we can't think from the perspective of how to work with the banking system we have as it is. We have to ask, what banking and financial system do we need? We don't need experts from the realm of global banking telling us that we're not sophisticated enough to know what we need. We need transparent financial processes, financial instruments, starting with blended finance, defined in such a way that they work for everyday people and everyday economies. We need to empower ourselves to ask, what do we need our financing system to do? My answer is, we need to support basic levels of support for human beings across the world via financing that is not subject to capture by corruption and self-aggrandizement for short-term benefit. We need a globally responsive, people-centered, humane financial system to help us figure out the way forward to more circular, sustainable economies. Thank you for your attention. This is weirdly a phrase from that group of experts report. They had it was a very nice report. They had nice words. And here was one, and the world needs a new harmony. Thank you. And then to bend the arc of history, we must succeed in Africa. And as you'll see, that's a perfect handoff to Penny for her to come with her commentary. Thank you for your attention.
Gary, thank you very much. Very enlightening. Lots of questions. Perhaps I will leave my question to the end and give Penny the floor. Please go ahead. I think you can, yes, you can share your PowerPoint. Or you want us to do it?
No, it's fine. I'll share it from here. If you don't mind, I just need to share the screen. Yes.
Yeah, just double hit that. It takes 2 hits to get it going. I'm going to mute myself.
Can I ask if people can see?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Let me begin by thanking everybody for inviting me to be here to really participate in what has been for me a fascinating and delightful 3-evening series, listening to the wisdom and the humanity of Gary has been a wonderful reminder again of who he is, including his very beautiful dedications to Eugenia and Fernando and other brave people. And so thank you very much. I'm going to just pull a few threads out of the work that I am familiar with over the years from Gary's interventions, from the work that I know of his. For me, his work on financial inclusion was really quite seminal for myself because he set out a spatial theory of banking and finance underpinned by a profound understanding of power and profit. And when I first encountered Gary's work at the very end of the 1990s, I was beginning to study with Sheila, and I was particularly engaged with trying to understand financial provision in a country like South Africa, which was just starting to awaken as a country that had just been through a democratic process, It had an icon as a leader, but financially it was very obvious that there was a very small enclave of financial provision and a huge sea of financial exclusion, mostly along racial lines. And some of Gary's work provided an insight into what was going on. And so tonight I'm just going to talk about really 4 very small threads of his work. The idea of the spectrum of financial provision in the super included, understanding space and innovation as driving profitability, and then having a very micro example, the failure of a South African bank called African Bank, and then an international example. So let me begin with the spectrum of financial provision. The financial provision is spectrum of financial provision is really a very clumsy attempt to try and express the idea of liquidity preference across classes of borrower. And this idea at the one end of those that are super included, who obtain credit at lower rates, at all kinds of additional dealings, are at the one end, and that term super included came from Gary. And then the far end is this group that I've seen as the over excluded. And in between here are what Keynes has referred to as the unsatisfied fringe of borrowers. And although there was some discussion last night about how Keynes didn't acknowledge power, there clearly was something that he understood, because he spoke about this fringe as being included from time to time when the banks chose to beat the bushes to expose additional borrowers. So he understood something about brutality, if not power. Now in South Africa, what was happening within our environment was that there was this very strong pressure. So let me just go back one slide. There was very strong pressure post-democracy to push for an improvement in financial inclusion.
Actually, Penny, may I ask? I think we're just watching your title slide. So if you could maybe.
Oh, I'm sorry. I wonder why.
Yeah, it's not advancing. Okay.
Yeah, it's not advancing. If you could maybe hit the full screen view and perhaps see if you can move it on your side so we can watch you go through.
Is anything happening now?
Not now.
No. Nomi, I wonder if I could ask if you could perhaps.
Yes, we will do it. 1 second, please. Can you stop sharing, please?
Yes.
Jorge, ¿ya lo tiene?
1 moment, please.
Jorge will be helping us because I'm not very technological wise.
Okay, let me.
¿Ya estás?
1 moment, please. Okay.
Amplíala, por favor. Hazla grande. Hazla grande, por favor. Amplíala, se ve muy chica.
It's okay?
Muy chica.
Good. Yeah.
Okay.
Still chica. Yeah.
Let me.
So if you could move down to about slide 4.
This one?
That's perfect. Thank you. So
okay.
That's the spectrum of financial provision I was trying to explain, where you can see this idea of different kinds of liquidity preference with different kinds of financial providers. Those are the bars along the line. And then on the far end, you have the super included. These are the people who get preferential access. And then at the other end, those who are over excluded, so just simply out of the system. And then you have the fringe in the middle. Now, these fringe represent for us a very interesting group of people, because they are the people who move in and out of inclusion, often when they move out of inclusion when they most need it. And so we see that if we look at this, that if you bear this in mind and you think about the South African story post-democracy, what was happening was that there was a huge pressure from the state for there to be more inclusion, at the same time that there was this huge desire by people to be included within the financial sphere. Could you go to the next slide? Okay, now these are data from South Africa in 2008. So this is, 14 years after democracy. But what you can see in those bars is percentage of the population. Can you just please press enter? I want you to just see the percentages of the population. So you could see 25% of the population who were in the lowest income group had almost no access at all to any kind of credit or any kind of provision, except perhaps family and friends and Mashonisa or Stokvels, people who were, saving together within community. Then a large proportion of the population, almost half of them, were included. These people had access to unsecured credit. That's the red line. And what you can see is that most of that was provided by a series of banks who were able to ensure repayment by virtue of taking the salary from state employees, deducting their value from the state salary run. If you can press enter again. And then you could see these are the people who are now getting included, 22% of the population. And if you press enter one more time, you'll see that 6% of the population represented the super included, and they had access to 400 billion rands worth of credit, even though they represented 6% of the population. If you could just go on. Next slide, please. So let me talk to you a little bit about the failure of African Bank. So could you go back one? Yes, African Bank was a micro-lending bank. It started just after democracy, and it worked on the basis of the Usury Act. And one of the reasons why the South African example is so palpable in terms of this inclusion and exclusion is that there was providers who could operate within the auspices of the Usury Act, which had strict interest rate controls, and then there were those who operated outside of the Usury Act. There was an exemption to the Usury Act that said you could give small unsecured loans at any rate whatsoever. So there was no interest rate capping. And for something like this little bank, which became bigger and bigger, they had a system where they only offered small loans to consumers and credit cards, and they had wholesale funding. And most of their clients were Black and in formal employment. They were in the state sector, and collections came from the state payroll. African Bank was the sweetheart of investors. They said that they wanted to meet the needs of those people who had been shut out by the apartheid state. In 2012, they were seen as Banker of the Year because their profitability was so exceptionally high. And they had their first Swiss bond issued, was very successful, but it was clearly a very fair weather balance sheet. It was something of a Ponzi scheme. They had to continue to draw in funds so that they could push out loans. And while they were doing that, they were profitable. But by 2014, as the sixth biggest bank in South Africa in terms of assets with 3 million clients, they went into curatorship. Next slide, please. And it was really because they had so many bad debts. At the time that they went into receivership, 30% of their book was in exceptional delinquency, in that they had received no payments for over 120 days. The Reserve Bank, the South African Reserve Bank, was very distant from them, but did allow them to reduce their reserve requirements by half. They took no responsibility, in fact, the Reserve Bank. And to Gary's points yesterday about how the central banks are part of the system, but in this particular case, it was quite clear there was no saving at least half the bank. And so the bank was split into good and bad, but there was no prosecution of bad bankers. There was just pursuance of bad borrowers. Thank you. Next one. And of course, the model here was all about this originate and distribute. This had very little to do with the needs of the fringe and everything to do with the logic of customer segmentation and profit maximization. And I would put it to you that within this acknowledgement of the importance of space and geography, customer segmentation along economic lines is very much part of that picture. And of course, this push towards financial inclusion in South Africa is aligned with a very aggressive model where loans were pre-scored, customers were offered pre-scored loans, and if they did, in fact, approach the banks themselves, they were offered loans many times the value they requested. And for a somewhat naive consumer population, there was this understanding that if somebody offers you a huge loan, that you're good for it somehow. And so these loans were taken on. But the big issue, of course, was that the outcome reflects the power system, the power relations implicit in the system. Thank you. Next one. I want to now turn this notion of the international, of the spectrum of provision into a spectrum of international financial provision, and just give you an example, some very brief slides on special drawing rights and how I think it relates very much to Gary's work on this understanding of power and space within the international system, as well as a micro understanding. If we think about, I mean, we all know that there's been a new allocation of special drawing rights of $650 billion this last August. But perhaps what people are less familiar with is the understanding that SDRs were first conceived and promoted at UNCTAD in the early 1960s with the explicit objective to try and link two objectives. The one is to allow a multilaterally managed reserve asset to meet reserve accumulation requirements and to facilitate real resource transfers to developing countries. But of course, that link was lost when the IMF became the originator of the SDR facility, because the SDRs became subject to the IMF's quota system, which very much favors rich economies. We know that SDRs are an international reserve asset used in transactions between member state central banks and, of course, between them and the IMF. And we know also that it's not about work in the private markets, but it does provide potentially some kind of fiscal relief to countries. What is very special about SDRs is that they are allocated to IMF members without eligibility criteria. This makes them really unique in the IMF realm. They do not create new debt, but they boost international reserves, and they provide liquidity support, if you like, for countries in the first instance. For many developing countries, SDRs are a very important reserve asset, and in fact, many countries just hold them as such. But for others, of course, they are used very importantly to support liquidity, to support exchange rates, and so on. We've done a little bit of work in having a look at who has used their SDRs. There are 190 countries who've been allocated these SDRs. And in the past, so the previous allocation, 108 members, IMF members, used them. What rankles in this story is, of course, that the huge amount of, the largest amount of it, 63% of the allocation goes to the advanced countries, of which there are 40, and the rest goes to 150 developing countries. And of the developed countries, those 40 countries, only 65% have used their SDRs at all, and they've on average only used 13% of those SDRs. And you can compare that to small island development states where over 80% of them have used the SDRs, and they've used nearly 50% of them on average, a very similar kind of ratio for low income developing countries. Thank you. The next slide. Sorry, this is very small now on your screen, but if you will get a chance to have a look at this, I'm sure, and you will see that of the developing countries, the low-income countries, although they receive what looks like a very small allocation, they only get 1.4% of the allocation of the SDRs. It still makes up, the SDR allocation still makes up 70% of their short-term debt burden. So you can see that for the little pie chart there, that black part is the share that goes to the 40 advanced or developed countries, and 150 other countries share the rest, with the white bar being the middle income countries, who I always see as very much these countries who are part of the included, but they really do remain part of this fringe. So they're in and out often when they least need it, least can afford it. Can you just give us the next slide, please? I've only got 2 more slides or so. I think the one thing I just wanted to do was just focus very briefly on SDR use by vulnerable country regions, and I focused here on sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. And you can see that the sub-Saharan African countries and Latin American Caribbean, they use the SDRs. They really need it within their systems. They employ it as and when they can. But of course, part of the mystery of the use of the SDRs is why, even when you look at these sub-Saharan African countries who have very high ratios of reserves to short-term debt, and in many cases, it's the mix who have the highest ratios of reserves to short-term debts. There are even countries in these groupings who are hoarders, who not only don't use the SDRs that they were allocated, but they hoard additional values of SDRs. And these are countries that really, they acknowledge their terrible vulnerability. They acknowledge the outcomes of those relations that Gary was showing us, the current account, the capital account, and reserves. These things have to match. If you are a country on the edge of the fringe, then you have to always have reserves to retain some kind of position in the system. Thank you. One more slide. So what we are doing in UNCTAD is that we are actually calling for special purpose SDRs. The reason we're calling for those is because a reallocation of SDRs, which many people have been favoring, including the de facto global authority that Gary mentioned, G20, is that to push these SDRs into trusts and then on-lend them. But as you would have spotted the mistake in my words, the very fact that SDRs are put into a trust and on-lend denatures that wonderful, unique capacity that SDRs do not give you debt. But once they're in a trust and they're loaned on, they increase your debt levels. And so we are calling for the creation of special purpose SDRs, which are delinked from IMF's quota and can actually be directed towards climate adaptation projects, which the developing world so desperately needs. Thank you. I think I have one last slide before I stop my comments. Okay, you didn't get the final version, but the last thing I just wanted to say in my final words were simply about pointing out how the story, whether you look at a micro level or a macro level or an international level, is this very similar understanding of the world being one of power and the use of space to generate those power relations. The one comment that Gary made this morning that I think I just wanted to respond to was that he said, what must be financed should always be equal to how can it be financed. And the one last thought I wanted to leave with you was the ambition that we need to have to think about how previous systems allowed for that. And the particular example I want to give to you is the London Debt Agreement in 1953, which was the agreement that was agreed with the West and post-World War II Germany. And what was agreed in that agreement was that all 50% of Germany's private and public debt would be forgiven and eliminated, and all the rest of its debt would be repaid over a period that was not defined by time, but was defined by the ability of Germany to earn money on its export account, on its current account. And the idea was that debt servicing for Germany should never be more than 3% of its export earnings. And that held within it the implicit requirement that the West would buy Germany's exports. And that was a way in which what needs to be financed and how it can be financed was matched. And you compare that now to the way in which the IMF's debt sustainability analyses have at a preeminent level the need for timeous repayment of creditors. That is its primary purpose. It is not to empower developing countries on how to actually find a mechanism so that what needs to be financed can be matched by an understanding of how it can be matched in the global world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Penny Hawkins. A wonderful comment. Let me summarize a few ideas, perhaps to kick off the discussion. We started arguing that we live in an extremely unequal society which is dysfunctional today for economic growth. It looks like the COVID crisis has shown that. But we have a lot of international liquidity, an excess, I would say. Actually, I would speak from Latin America, an excess liquidity in our economies, an excess foreign liquidity, with what Gary has been highlighting. A few included, many excluded from the financial system. This is the condition of today's Latin American situation. But why? What happened? My argument, if I may, is that this excess liquidity coming, I would say, from the north, seems again not to have any links with domestic institutions. And it's used for stabilizing the macroeconomic. So something needs to be done. Finally, I will say that in Spanish now. Thanks for bringing the SDR discussion. A few weeks ago, we got them in Mexico, and the government was demanding the central bank to handle this reserve, to pay external debt. We wanted to increase debt, but however, pay external debt. And the central bank claimed that it cannot handle these financial resources to government. It must go into the international reserve, which are extremely high in Mexico. So we really didn't make much use of it. So your proposition to change the view of SDR will be very, very welcome in this part of the world. Now, what to do? There are a lot of propositions. I won't say. I will tell what I said now in Spanish, perhaps to kick off the discussion. Rápidamente quiero plantear tres o cuatro temas que creo que podemos discutir después de estas tres maravillosas sesiones y los tres comentarios que hemos recibido de nuestros especialistas. Estamos ante una desigualdad creciente en el mundo capitalista, en Latinoamérica, que se vuelve disfuncional para el crecimiento económico. Ese es un problema que tenemos. Segundo, curiosamente, tenemos flujos de capital internacionales inmensos, pero tenemos esta historia de los pocos incluidos y de las grandes masas excluidas. Eso es claro en Latinoamérica. ¿Por qué? Nosotros tenemos que el gran capital, banca, corporaciones no financieras, no tiene conexiones con el mercado doméstico. O es maquila o no está dentro del sistema financiero. En este contexto, ya, ¿para qué viene el gran capital y por qué tanto lo buscamos? Es porque queremos estabilizar la macro sin importarnos la micro. Finalmente, quiero agradecer a la doctora Hawkins por haber traído la discusión de las SDRs. Recuerden que hace un par de semanas, quizás un mes, el gobierno exigía al Banco Central que le den el dinero que le tocó a México por el monto de los SDRs. ¿Qué contestó el Banco Central? Cuidado, tenemos autonomía, tenemos que incrementarla ya de por sí, grandes reservas, y no lo puedes utilizar. No hubo caso al final, lamentablemente. Bienvenida la propuesta de UNCTAD de volver a discutir qué hacer con ese recurso que hubiera servido al menos para reducir los intereses de la deuda. Abro la discusión y escuchamos sus opiniones. Si quieren, por favor, levanten. Ya tenemos a David Barkin. Por favor, hagamos una lista. Y David, quisiera, si quieres, prende micrófono y, ¿cómo se llama? Y cámara para que hagas tu intervención. Pedimos que sea corta para esperando que otros quieran participar. Adelante, por favor, David. David, ¿nos escucha? Or perhaps, Gary, you want to answer, or you answer at the end? David doesn't...
Your mic. Your mic is...
Gary?
We can't hear you, Professor Gary.
Okay, I'm sorry for that.
Okay.
I was going to say, happy to say a couple of things, but I wonder to, you've set the table well, but I wonder too, is Sunanda still on the line, and would she have some comments?
Sunanda?
I'm trying to unmute, right?
It's okay.
After listening to both the speakers, I do not think there is much to be added to what has been analyzed and described. One thing bothers me, even though, it's important, Gary, to change the system by hitting at the mega banks. But yes, mega banks definitely are responsible. They have been responsible for many of the problems. But at the same time, what they do is monitored by the financial system, which is run by absolutely, you have been mentioning this all through your lectures, by securitization. And how does securitization come about? It comes about because of the absence of capital controls and with the prevalence of the hedging, and it is affecting each and every institution. The corporates are affected, the banks are affected. Now we find in the context of India, we are often even the microfinance institutions, they are failing because they are lending to the stock market. The balance sheet is always important for any fund manager. So, that keeps happening. And like that, it comes to Penelope's arguments about the financial status. In India, what has been happening, that a lot of non-performing assets have been accumulated by the mega banks, right? the public sector banks in particular, and they are largish. They are quite large compared to the private banks. Now these non-performing assets now are being collected. How did they have occurred because of political reasons? You know, they lend money to all kinds of.
Ahorita
Sorry,
que te lo abran.
yeah. Sorry, you say something.
No, no,
No.
go ahead. Yeah.
So you see, how did the NPAs accumulate in the system with the mega banks? That happened because of the political reason. You know, it is very simple. It has been happening all over. You know, those who are in favor to the ruling government, well, they can get easy loans and they can do whatever they want to. So in the process, the NPAs are accumulating, the balance sheets are in trouble. And now the government is suggesting something, it's crazy, that, you know, they will spend a huge amount in buying back that debt. It reminds me of 1982 debt situation, where debt was sold in the market at, you know, at a nominal price. So the debts will be sold, and then the bad bank, bad bank, the bad banks will collect them, and then the bad bank will somehow manage and see, you know, with government subsidy, whether, you know, it can be liquid, it can be managed. Now, what does it mean? It means, you know, those who in a very corruptive way, they manage to borrow from the banks and have run away without paying it back. They're lucky, and this will be paid by the taxpayers' money, by you and me. That's kind of thing. So I think these are the things, and the solution comes definitely in changing the financial system, the mega banks, but also bringing back capital controls. Without that, I don't think system will survive. Thank you.
Por favor, el primero que levantó la mano, David Barkin.
Gracias.
Adelante, profesor. Tiene la palabra.
Muchas gracias. Frustrante tu control tan fabuloso. Tengo dos tipos de preguntas. Uno para Gary, o comentarios para Gary. Tú hablas del, I'm sorry, I should talk in English. You're speaking of spatial hierarchies, but you left out, and you talk about marginalization, and you give the model of the Brazilian favelas, where you spent some time. But you left out for me, one of the most important levels, and that's the planet, where we all live, and where most of the people of the world are excluded, are not included in the way in which resources are allocated. Now, that's the first comment. And for Penelope, I have a question, because yes, the SDRs could be an important element, an important resource, and Naomi's mentioning of the struggle here in Mexico is extraordinarily important. But most of the people in our societies are not bankable and are not clients of the banks. They're clients of an informal system. The graph that you showed in Brazil, I think it was Brazil, or was it you, Gary? Is very, very illustrative, but the people who are on the lowest level of that are paying extraordinarily high interest rates. They're paying, well, I would call it usury. and they're being deprived of their very, very basic access to resources. So the kinds of societies that depend upon the banking system are societies that are based upon a model of consumption and a model of social interaction, which is inimical to the sustainable development, the sustainable management of the world economy. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Nancy, por favor, adelante. Después está Luis Raúl. Después de Luis Raúl, le damos la palabra a Gary para que no se le junten tanto. Después está Ricardo, ok.
Yeah.
Nancy, adelante, por favor.
Thank you, Doctor. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you, Professor and Dr. Hawkins, for sharing us your wide perspective and your expertise, because it allows us to learn and ask ourselves the right questions. Well, my question is about the study of regions that, like you say, Professor, had so many particularities. I remember that Hirschman, also Frank Silver talk about the importance of studying these particularities. But nowadays, I think that there are a lot of studies that are so specific in order to be specialized of one theme or one region that we are losing the big perspective of the problems. In order to study aspects very bound or so well defined. But sometimes I think that some problems need to be studied with particularities, but into a system. That means to study a lot of variables, maybe in general, but considering as much as variables as the problem need to be explained. So I would like to know, what do you think about study the problems in a holistic view? Do you think that it's necessary to integrate that particularities of some regions into the dynamics of the whole system in order to solve the big problems, like all those kind of inequalities?
Gracias, Nancy. Seguimos con Luis Raúl, por favor.
Hello. Thank you, Gary, for your presentation. Thank you, Naomi, for giving me the word here. Actually, I want to ask you, maybe it's quite a specific question. What do you think, or have you think about the role of the central banking here? In the sense that, I mean, we are at the periphery. As Naomi said, we are a developing country. We suffer, we are a quite open developing country. So we suffer a lot of these flows in and out all the time. So I think that the central bank has two roles here. One of them is obviously the policy rate, the setting the policy rate. In the last two crises, in the 2008 and in the last COVID crisis, the central bank in Mexico in the first days of the 2008 crisis actually hiked the rate. I mean, it was like everybody in the developing world was lowering the rate a lot, and Mexico was hiking the rate. So, and in the COVID-19, actually, Bank of Mexico lowered the rate, but not as much as the US. So that make people in this traumatic events or these crashes in the market to face shortage in liquidity. That this is less liquidity than is recommended for this kind of events. That's one thing. And the other thing that I was thinking about is that central banks in all our countries have very different approaches to social money. There are some central banks, like Mexico's central bank, that is fighting a war against social money or any of these initiatives. But there has been another events or instances, for instance, in England, in the the Bristol pound, or another ways in which the people can develop their own money, so their own monetary strategy to develop an area that is stripping of cash in those particular moments. So I wanted to ask you if you have thought about it, if you know something about it that can guide us in this question, looking for this what the central banks do in these cases. Thank you very much.
Gary, and then Penny, if you want.
No,
if you
we
want to
have
ask
another question.
Okay, dejemos a Ricardo Edmundo. Okay, gracias. Let give the last one and then you reply, please.
Okay.
Adelante, Ricardo.
Sí, gracias. Gary, my question is perhaps a bit of a provocation, shall I say. It seems to me that you discuss very extensively and from very interesting viewpoints the pros and cons of various institutional financial arrangements pertaining to financing things like conversion to carbon neutrality or changing perhaps the index associated with the reduction of carbon emissions and attaining to broad social needs in general. And you discuss, for example, what the problems might be with using the infrastructure of shadow banking to undertake this kind of enterprise, and so on and so forth. And it's a very interesting discussion. It seems to me, however, that you are avoiding a central problem, which is profitability. And in other words, are you suggesting in some way that a proper institutional arrangement of the financial sector can avoid the requirement of profitability in this kind of undertaking? Or are you saying that actually it is or can be profitable to attain broad social needs? The only problem is that these profitable areas of opportunity are not financed.
Gracias. Penny, Gary, who wants to go first?
Oh, let me go first, so I can begin by thanking Penelope. I have to say, we should all sleep easier at night knowing that Penny Hawkins and Daniela Prates and Stephanie Blankenberg and Richard Kozel-Wright are this great team, and others at UNCTAD are doing their best to think forward and to advocate in these halls of power. And of course, there's so many constraints that with which they must work. And those constraints make that work very frustrating. And especially because in those halls of power, they must use very civil language and follow all of the protocols. So at moments like these, where Penny can hear that, the people are with you, these are really important moments. And I want to add my voice of appreciation for just the brilliance with which you have undertaken your analysis. Let me go down, and there's so much to say, but let me just hit some of the points. First, freeing the role of the IMF here is something that is really a problem at the center of solving the global fix. We have as Penny noted, the IMF is a 1 pound equals 1 vote system. And yes, there's consideration of changing that and increasing the share of China, et cetera. But it's still bound by that. And to basically even make that change would be remarkable. It does strike me that the idea that SDRs are pushed out according to these quotas, and then they have to be voluntarily given, is a kind of absurdity that leads to, on the one hand, the strange hoarding you talk about, and on the other hand, this kind of unused capacity when people are suffering. So that's that. Just to say that I remember, and I think it was the 2018 meeting that I attended in November, where there was this discussion with the IMF representative. He's a director of strategy there. And my comment to him was, look, the IMF cannot be the policeman of the world and also the think tank. And that, that was something that now when we see Gorgieva as the, if I've said her name properly, as the managing director, she's opened a new page of ambition. But I think that there's possibly the possibility of having a very productive dialogue about in what way can the IMF be a not only a part of a thinking presence about what has to be done, but also a sort of innovator institutionally. That's first. Second, COVID. There was no November 2020 experts meeting. That meeting occurred in February, and that meeting was it had great people as it always does. But that meeting was the experts who came there. Everybody was focused on COVID, and in some sense, I stayed away from COVID in my speech tonight. I was searching around for data in that presentation that got lost. And one of the challenges is what do we do with the COVID era data, because all the numbers get really strange really fast. And in particular, that conversation from November 2019 about, well, how can we solve the SDR or the SDGs and the climate crisis using this mechanism has indeed turned into another kind of conversation. So, we are and what we're seeing at the center is the fragility of the nation states and then of the people that are served badly or well by those nation states. So that was just a couple of comments there on her themes. Noemi, your idea of basically the excess liquidity of that is there and not needed, that's a point that I heard in Mexico and elsewhere for that matter. In some sense, that's the accompaniment of those excess reserve holdings that I point out in my presentation. I had more countries to show, but it's the same pattern. And I remember Joe Stiglitz in the Stiglitz Commission, I attended some of those sessions, and he was, one of his big points was just blasting this waste of, this is a resource and capacity to do something with that's just being wasted globally. He was right, of course. Now, for him, however, to be right, we then go to for him to not only be right, but to do something about it. With those reserves, we have to then go to, in a sense, Sunanda's point. And let's just stop for a minute and recognize that your Mr. Carstens at the Central Bank of Mexico is now at the BIS. And just saying, we'll come to central bank in a second, but just to say that Sunanda makes the point of, how do we, changing the system, yes, they are monitored, and there is increasing monitoring by the BIS, by these other entities. At the same time, these entities still innovate, or they still compete by innovation. That's one reason that, again, that I had a compressed presentation, not time to say everything, but the leverage loans are precisely an example of something that was not foreseen. And the next thing you knew, we didn't look at the numbers. Next thing you know, there's billions of dollars in these new instruments that are a very, uncertain value for anything other than pumping up the coffers of the income flows of some of these mega banks and their brokers and so on. And so, at some level, Sunanda, you're right. The thing is that the example you cite, is that the banks in India being devoted to political reasons, and being, the system being twisted in that way. Penny's talked about a famous micro bank, much celebrated, that's run afoul of bad things. We could think of even in Germany, the famous Sparkassen and Landesbanken, long celebrated as this, rock solid German banking system, the model for the world. Actually, they've come on some hard times too, and the Landesbanken really got in trouble with the subprime crisis. Same thing for the cajas in Spain. So there's no one institutional form that is immune from corruption. And so now to your point that capital controls will be part of the solution, has to be right to in part avoid the propagation of these things and this kind of footloose international money. The money that should be moving internationally, leaving aside, hedging against risks and so on, and that is another discussion. That money should be for international purposes, and trade and so on, and not for speculation. And what we see now with these artificially low interest rates, again, in respect of the need to protect the mega banks, is bubble-driven growth, as we talked the other day. So we have to get past that, and how. Now, on to perhaps I'll come back to the central bank in a minute, but just to say that actually let me stay on central bank and good old Karsten. Karstens, you're laughing, but we have to laugh because there is a good Chicago boy who now when we say, as the discussant said, I think it may have been it wasn't Ricardo. It was Louise. Louise, okay. Let me come to your question in the central bank. Yes, the central bank is independent, but I was thinking of Karsten's when you said that, because yes, he's independent, but he's the central banker of Mexico. He's not the central banker of the Federal Reserve, and actually being at the BIS, it's a very interesting position for him because you're independent, but you're part of this social context. It goes to Nancy's point. It's a holistic context. Yeah, you've got a very open economy, money flowing in and out. You've got to be wary of people speculating. You're not in control of that. When you see your president go and say, okay, we're going to open up more exploration and we're going to double down on our fossil fuels investments, investors are going to react, and you yourself have got to react to that as the central banker. You've got no choice. So in some sense, those wide open capital flows are part of the problem. The other part I would mention would be that as you talk about the management of the system, that one concern is, can you control people who will use those open flow possibilities to fly to safety? Now, notice that depends on what your tax code is, how wealth is controlled, other dimensions of the political economy of the country that are outside of the strict province of the central bank. So again, we do have to think again using that word holistically there. As far as social money, I think let's say that's got to be another conversation because I'm going on too long. But just to say that this idea of escaping from oversight and finding a way outside of the capitalist circle is something that I think that leads us into a conversation that we might have had last night with David, and sort of extending that discussion of how far out can you go. And speaking of that, I would just agree with David's point tonight that leaving aside the planet, for sure, the planet is there, but I think David, you had a double meaning. Leaving aside the planet, and I would mention that actually, working with people, colleagues, even today and these days, on this idea of how does one value these things? How do we value it from a different perspective than the use for humankind or the use for capital accumulation of the assets that come from the earth? And to me, a diamond is not worth the life of one young boy in Africa. So what the hell are we doing? Not to mention lithium and all these things. But so there's that. The fact that people are not bankable, that's going to go over to Penny, so I'll leave that one there. And let me just go to Ricardo's point, and then finally Nancy's. And I think I'm not excluding anybody. So Ricardo, the institutional arrangements you raise a really devilish question, and this is a question that I think we're going to have to really push on. Is it that this infrastructure, shadow banking and other things, can it be managed? Must it be disciplined? Yes, it must, of course. But is it that it could be used for good and it just isn't? Or do we have to take it apart and do something else? The taking it apart will cause a crash of the capitalist world, full stop, as we know it. We're kind of seeing a test case with the City of London tiptoeing toward the brink now. How far it's going to go is interesting to watch. They're very adaptive people, but I think in some sense, can the City of London shrink itself in turn into a different kind of entity? I don't know the answer because in some sense, I mean, I took some classes at the Wharton School when I was at Penn, and some of the people I was in class with, those kind of people that, their job was to outcompete you and to screw you if they could. That was their basic approach to life. That's who they were. This was MBA people and all of that. And there are people like that all over the world. Can you channel this hyper competitive instinct in the direction of doing social good? How do we get people to compete to say, how can we have a better long-term fix? If I'd had the time, and I decided to go with the urban example, especially because I blew up my earlier presentation, I would have just used some of that game theory to show that there's real problems of getting these bankers to think long-term when there's short-term money to be made. Don't leave money on the table is a rule in poker. And that's what you're, in a sense, asking people to do. So we need a new system there. And finally, rather than to talk about something that would be pure speculation, just to say that Nancy, we absolutely have to think holistically. And I think that a long time ago, I started out as a community organizer, urban studies major, and I worked for a while in a community-based organization in Indianapolis. And for whatever reason, one of our leaders was, he read Otto Ranke, the German philosopher. And according to him, Ranke had this expression that said, what you need to do is to be on the inside of the outside and the outside of the inside. Now, I translate that in turn when I do my economics into be with the people and be broad-minded and open to what that is. At the same time, I don't want to walk into a seminar room and not be able to understand the mathematics or the models of mainstreamers. I don't want to sit there and say, oh, your model is the devil, and I have no use for it. And furthermore, I don't understand it. No, it's not that hard. And actually, what they're doing is usually very trivial. And so the thought is, on the inside, know the language. Joe Stiglitz wants to use a language of asymmetric information. Is that a problem? I don't know, but it's the language he uses. And so we talk to Joe Stiglitz in that language.
Professor Dymski, you turn off your mic.
My apologies. Yeah, I hit the wrong button. Hopefully it wasn't 5 minutes ago, but let me just conclude by saying, in making sure I got to Nancy's question, that we must be holistic. We must speak several different languages. We're responsible to speak the languages of the professions that we occupy and to reach out. We're going to need the mainstream to come along with us as we transform this world. And so, what's going to happen is that the mainstream is going to take the ideas and not credit us. You can look up Minsky's name in mainstream journals and you're not going to find it, as we showed the other day. And that's because that's who they are. They're going to be up front. It's going to be the Harvard and Yale people who are going to take the credit, and the Oxford and Cambridge and all that. That's the way this world works. And so our job is to figure out what the plan is, what the ideas are, to be bold and brave and holistic indeed, to bring those perspectives together, to take chances, to work with the people, to know what the speech of the expert communities is, limited as it is, and push them to be better and to think deeper. And in the case of spatial economics, to think in spatial scales across disciplines and across the realms of power and exclusion. Thanks. I'll stop there.
Penny, would you like to say something?
Yes, thank you. Just very briefly, such a exciting intervention and very special to listen to people's views. I just really wanted to respond very briefly. I thought perhaps I misunderstood you in some way, Ricardo, but I thought perhaps I could respond to the point that you raise about profitability. And I mean, I think everybody understands here that the system works with profit. But I think what I find deeply concerning is how financial capital often manages to make profit and to de-risk, which simply means transferring of risk to the people who are least able to bear that cost. And they do it particularly across nation states, borderlines. So, you know, capital flows in, it flows in because it's hungry, it wants that profit, it gobbles up the profit. And when the country says, I cannot repay you, it falls to the IMF and says, we're one of the people that this country owes money to. And so better you make sure we are paid. And the IMF's models, for all that they are gaining in sophistication and that they have such incredibly bright people working there, their models for the DSA have a basic assumption that there is full employment.
Yep.
And if you believe there's full employment, there's only one recommendation you can make. Your model can do no other. And that is, for us to change the system, we need to change where the spending is. And the only thing that the IMF can recommend is to cut government spending. So fiscal austerity is the natural outcome of that model. And so here I am as a banker, I've raped and pillaged, I've got my reward, but I will still have every last drop of blood from that country. And I don't think we are arguing necessarily against profitability per se, but we are arguing against untrammeled, unregulated, and risk-free profitability, because that is not the system that we think we subscribe to. And then with regard to microbanks, David, I quite understand where you come from in terms of this incredible sea of lack of provision. What we've seen in South Africa is that we had this massive push to include people into the system, and people to some extent resisted it. And part of the reason they resisted it is that, you know, whereas from a perspective of saying, well, we want to be part of the system, financial inclusion is good, a very poor person will say to you, you know, I need to have a cell phone and I need to pay for the money to have the cell phone and airtime, but I don't have to have a bank account. And so this is part of why I think, you know, yesterday the matter of cryptocurrencies came up, crypto assets. And I think part of what's pushing crypto acceptance in developing countries is that the current systems, the current structures, the current banking have not actually met the needs of some of those who are excluded. And so remittances are, you know, they're certainly not easy through crypto assets, but they're appealing because it doesn't start with a banking system. And I think, you know, this is part of the concern that we still have in South Africa. African Bank charged usurious rates. There's no question of that. But they were protected by a system that said, we will drive for inclusion at all costs. And so as a consequence, they made those loans to people who probably couldn't afford them. And then as far as they could, they grabbed it from people's salaries, those collections, before people were paid. And so that was a system that worked, but eventually it ran out. It was not sustainable.
Thank you. Are there any more questions?
We have two more.
Ricardo ya habló, ¿no?
he wants to do another question.
Well, no, le dejamos primero la palabra
Carlos Alberto.
a Carlos Alberto, por favor.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I appreciate Mr. Dymski to be here with us talking about geography and finance. I just have a comment because of I mean, the last comments that the conversation went through thinking about the economy in regards of profit, right? Like if the final end of an economy development is the profit. But I mean, I like to I like to mention something that obsessed me since I understood how the U.S. economy is structured, because we always talk about the private enterprises and so on, but we do not always think about the military development and its economical consequences in a society, right? And I mean, and the military is so big. I mean, it's pretty big, and it also, I mean, it has developed. I mean, it is, in my opinion, as far as I understand it, it is the root cause of development and growth in the U.S. Not necessarily the private competition, but the state intervention through the military. So, in that sense, we can say that many of the investments that are being made or applied on the military sector are not profitable necessarily. So it's just an operation of I mean, they just have they don't want to make money. They want to make the faster plane to bomb us, to I don't know, to invade a city or something. So we can, I mean, by mentioning that, I just want to say that the there is I think that there is a superior even way of developing an economy, which is the state intervention, not by profits but by goals. Let's say, if that is the case, not the profits of the banks, but to stop the housing crisis in the cities, right? That's my opinion. I just want to share that, and that's it. Thank you.
Gracias, Carlos Alberto. Do you have some word with respect that comment?
Could I go first? I just want to say thank you, Carlos. I mean, certainly from our perspective in UNCTAD, we're very concerned about the fact that we need to move back towards a system where we acknowledge the role of the state, and that the state really does need to play a leading role. So thank you for that. And just, I mean, you know, I don't know enough about military intervention, but I mean, the very fact that you point to it is very important in a discussion around space, because clearly military intervention is about space and power. And that's all I say, but thank you. It was very interesting.
Yeah, let me jump in too, just briefly, just to say that I hear you. And actually, I would recommend that you might try to see if you can find some of the work of Fred Block. Fred actually had a group that was looking at the connections between the military-industrial complex and innovation in the economy, the invention of things, etc. Mariana Mazzucato, that's back when I was in California. Mariana was still in the U.S., and there were some other interesting people there. I think Leonardo Burlamark was part of that. And there was a series of books and papers. Of course, Mariana famously wrote her book, Entrepreneurial Estate, as a kind of point of reflection on that. You'll see a lot of that California-based thinking there. But in some sense, what Mazzucato was trying to do, and it was to basically turn what had been the idea of, right, people who want to have hand in hand, they want to make the money from their investments and their inventions, and they want to dominate and be able to lay waste to the world at will, have the most powerful military. And so Mariana is trying to uncouple those, I think, with her efforts. And it's been very interesting to see, her and their team push those ideas. We actually have some kind of, relationship with her group at UCL as we go forward ourselves here. And just to say that, that's something that we should keep in mind, that part of the problem of hegemony is not just who's got the monetary power, but who has the actual power. Right now, we're seeing this very dangerous competition heating up between China and the U.S. We sure don't need that, and I completely agree with you that we could work at different scales, bottom up as well as top down, on things like housing crisis, so we can put lots of people to work. And your comments do go in the direction that Nancy and actually I would say David and others are indicating, which is that there's multiple systems and ways of valuing that we must embrace. So thanks for the comment.
Su micrófono.
Llegado al final. La verdad, quisiera agradecer a los ponentes, quisiera agradecer a la Facultad de Economía, en particular al Departamento de Computación, Omar, Jesús. ¿Quisieras decir tú algunas palabras, Jorge? Para
Sí,
ya
sí, sí. Quiero agradecer. I want to thank both of you, Professor Gary Dymski and Penelope Hawkins, for these marvelous presentations and comments. And I want to make a special mention for, I'm going to switch to Spanish to say that. Quiero hacer una mención especial para la doctora Reina Rosas, que nos ayudó a organizar el evento, y a nuestros ayudantes del proyecto, Adriana Lozano, Omar Galván, Rommel Hernández y Rodrigo Zagarra, quien si no nos hubieran ayudado no hubiera sido posible hacer esto. Y obviamente agradecer a la audiencia por estar en esta última sesión. Thank you very much everyone for joining us in this last session. And Professor Noemi, you have the word, the final words, if you want.
Okay, thank you. Well, Penelope, here the only thing we can give you is this small diploma, thanking you really from the heart. Your presentation has been very important, and obviously, Gary, let me find yours, which is, you have been with us 3 whole nights for you, sharing your time. Let me find it. I hope you can, this is, oh, I cannot find yours. My God. But certainly there is a diploma for you, which I was planning to find it.
You lost it.
I lost it. Sorry, but you will get it. Usually happens. Let me see here. I think here it is. Let me see if I can open it. Can you see it now, Gary?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
Let me see now. Sorry. This, here you are. Yes, we have it. It's with us.
There you go.
Okay. So yes, I could find it.
It was lost in space.
Well, and well, it has been 3 extremely nice mornings, noon for us. I think students and teachers benefited from this discussion, and some things are good of COVID. We could have a real international course from Asia, representatives of Africa, Latin American, Europe. What else can we ask? Thank you very much.
Thank you from my heart to you and the team there. It's your solidarity, our comradeship and friendship with you, and our shared dialogues are completely fundamental to me, and I hold all of this in my heart, and it sends my mind forward too. So thank you for everything.
The same to you, Penny. Hope to start again our 20 years back conversations in the streets of London. Perhaps we can continue them from now on.
I
And
will look forward to that. Thank you.
no sé, here we finish this 3-day course. Thank you. Gracias a todos los que participaron estos 3 días. La verdad nos ha ayudado mucho. Para la
Thank you very
próxima.
much.
Nos
Thank
vemos.
you, everyone.
Thank you so
Buenas
much.
noches.
Thank you,
Good
your-
night.
Until the next one. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Jorge.